So just to introduce myself, my name's Asari Sobukwe. I'm just going to talk to you about the African perspective on the Brexit question, a very topical issue right now. So just going to give you our take on that situation and my particular slant on the implications of the Brexit vote, Britain's decision to leave the European Union, on the African community, both here in this country, but even more significantly, the African people as a whole. The European Union is very misunderstood by most people, I think, in Britain, and Africans less so, because maybe they're less interested in finding out about the history. But it's interesting, before we talk about the formation of the European Union, we need to give it some historical context, which is that there's a lot of language that is used in Western countries and a lot of language used in places like Britain that creates confusion. So, for example, we talk on black violence. We talk about tribalism, we talk about conflict in Africa, we talk about all these language, but what we don't talk about is, let's just stop there a second and go to Europe. Let's ask this question: when in Europe's history has there not been war? And you'll struggle to find out where in history there hasn't been war in Europe. Europe has had a history of war. The foundation of the European Union, which was the Economic European Community, whatever it was called, the EEC was it was known as at the beginning, but there was loads of different structures. But the basic principle behind European integration was on the back of two major wars, which are described as World War I and World War II, which were actually Europeans fighting Europeans, white on white violence ×2, because it wasn't a world war, it was a war between Europe that involved the world. So we just get that straight. And it was another example of war in Europe. So the World War I, as it's known, and World War II was Europe fighting itself, massacring its own people. If you look at World War I, millions of Europeans died, killed by other Europeans. So when we say black on black violence, we need to be very careful using this kind of language. I don't like that kind of language, because most people who are killed, in terms of general violence, are killed by somebody who knows you. So most violence is domestic, most murders are domestic. So by nature, the chances of being killed by somebody outside of your community is unlikely anyway. So therefore, the concept of black on black violence is a nonsense, because most white people are killed by another white person. So we need to look at it in that context. So Europe, the whole premise of the European Union was on the back of, they didn't want any more wars between European countries. That was the basic founding members' concept, to stop the wars against each other. And if you look at the foundation of America, it's basically the same. Is that the United States of America was, the founding fathers of the United States of America was to prevent more war within the United States itself. People don't realize the White House, for example, the first White House was burnt down by the British, because they fought with the British colonialism. Britain owned America, and then they fought for their independence, and the White House was burnt to the ground by the British. So there's lots of history of violence in Europe, between Europeans. So when you see the American Revolution, was that not white on white violence? It was only white people fighting other white people. When the North fought the South, and they said for independence and for the Union or for the Confederates in the South, that was white on white violence. And they got Africans involved because they needed our support in the North. So they promised us that they would end slavery if we joined them. So this is the context we're talking about. So the European Union was basically found on that basis. What was the basis for World War I? The basis for World War I, read the book The World and Africa by W.E.B. Du Bois. In that book, he says there were some major events in the world. And the major events in the 20th century, event number one was when the boat, a German warship, sailed into North Africa. Event number one, that's World War I. So why was World War I happen? Because Germany sailed into North Africa. Why did Germany sail into North Africa? What happened before World War I? Well, what happened before World War I was 1884, 1885, which is when Africa was split up. Yeah? When European leaders who owned the colonies effectively split Africa into different zones. So the end of the 19th century, that's what happened. When did World War I start? The beginning of the 20th century. So it was only a short period afterwards that Germany, being pissed, angry that they didn't get a slice of the cake, because where in Africa is there a German colony? They didn't get a slice of the cake. So they were angry about they didn't get a slice of the cake. So when the Germans didn't get a slice of the cake, they wanted a slice of the cake. They were a relatively powerful, strong nation in Europe, and they weren't getting a slice of the pie. So they marched into North Africa to say, we want a slice of this cake. And that was the beginning of the trigger of the First World War and therefore the Second World War. It was basically about Europe fighting itself over the colonies. That's basically what it was about. So the reason why the European Union was developed, because some of the leaders that were around at that time said we must never have war again. Places like France, for example, France was decimated. You can see so many different programs about French resistance and little jokes and little comments that make, where you see programs like Hello Hello and different programs like that where you saw the French resistance, and there's lots of different little examples. Even in The Great Escape, the film called The Great Escape, you see an example of when the British soldiers escaped. Who helped them? The French resistance. So France swore they will never have it happen again. France will never be occupied and controlled again. That's why France got nuclear weapons, and France said they're going to have a military, etc. So that's the kind of backdrop, and that's an important backdrop, but also what was going on. So one of the things with this situation was that was where Europe was uniting, but also at the same time, Africa was also moving in a different direction as well. So the fact that Europe had a war with itself weakened its hold over the colonies. It weakened Britain, because the war took so much effort out of Britain and so much decimation in Europe that at the end of the Second World War, Britain had to get a loan from America to rebuild itself. And Britain was indebted to America, and that's when America became a superpower and then became the preeminent power, and Britain's decline began. So Britain has been on the decline and America has been on the incline. So that's been the change and shift in power. So the British Empire basically had to concede to India, China, and loads of different places, which led to our independence. So interestingly, if you look at that history, the weakness in Europe and the problems that Europe were having made it easier for us to get our independence. And it made those weaknesses lead to our independence. So we need to realize that. So therefore, Brexit, when I come to talk about Brexit very shortly, the split of Europeans, the European Union, Britain leaving is a significant weakness in the European agenda in terms of European Union, because Britain is one of the most powerful, richest nations in the world. It therefore is a leading member of the European Union. It could lead to other members leaving. So if Britain gets a good deal, leaving the European Union, you could ask yourself, other countries in Europe could ask themselves, well, why are we in the European Union if Britain can get a good deal and be outside? Like any club, if you don't have to pay membership and get the benefits of the club, why would you stay a member? If I could still use my mobile phone but not pay for it, why wouldn't I get a mobile phone? So club membership normally means you get benefits. When you leave, you lose the benefits. It's simple, right? And if you've agreed to do things when you're in the club, when you leave early, you might have obligations you still have to pay for. So that's basically how it works. So what we have to understand is that the European Union was set up by the elite for the elite, basically. It wasn't a working class movement to unify Europe. So the drive for European Union and European integration has always been dominated by the elites of Europe. So big business leaders, political leaders, people of major institutions, scientific institutions, all types of government institutions, agricultural, the farming industry, the fisheries. These are the people, the military, well, maybe not so much the military, but the other institutions have been driving the integration. So therefore, it's been led by what you could call the elite, or the wealthier people in Europe. The working class have always been skeptical about the European Union because they're worried about what is in it for me, basically. And what I would argue is the reason that Brexit has happened is predominantly because the white working class haven't seen the full benefit of European integration. They feel that they're not getting the share of the pie. So therefore they feel, why am I paying into this club and I'm not getting all the benefits from it? But there's confusion in that, because rather than just see that the European Union hasn't worked for many of the working class in Europe, massive unemployment, well, most of Europe's got high unemployment. Britain hasn't got so much high unemployment because it's got a more liberal economy, but we're underemployed in Britain, which means that lots of people are employed, but they're underemployed. So they've got jobs, but they can't afford, that doesn't mean you've got a good standard of living. So we're in Europe, you're unemployed, but if you're unemployed in Europe, your benefit system is better. So you got more affordable housing, more affordable other public services, and the public services in Europe are generally better. So when you're unemployed in Europe, you're not as poor as in England. But when you're employed in England, which is more likely you got a job in England than you got in Europe, but a lot of the pay is quite low. And because public services are not that fantastic, like housing and things are so expensive, people are underemployed in Britain. So you're working, but you're struggling. So a lot of people in Britain are just about managing. So when the Brexit vote came about, and we got to look back, there's been a long, long campaign in Britain to leave the European Union. So when Labour took us into the European Union, they took the country into the European Union, there was a ballot, there was a vote, people voted to join. And they were given, it was establishment argument. So for example, Tony Benn, people like Tony Benn, who was a very distinguished MP, he was very sceptical about the European Union. And the left in this country, the left who predominantly represent the working class, has always been sceptical about the European Union. Tony Benn admitted in his diaries, he was told that Ford came to him as a minister and said, if you don't join the European Union, we're going to pull our factories out. So the British Labour government basically realised that basically if they don't join the European Union, or just like the Conservatives did as well, if they don't join the European Union, basically it looks like a lot of the big business, because people think Ford is British, Ford was American, just like General Motors, Vauxhall is not British, it's American. They said they're going to pull all their plants out if you don't join the European Union, because they had the benefits of the unity across Europe. So they could pull their plants out, move them to Spain, to France, to wherever. So the British government felt that they were really in a difficult position not to join the European Union. And also you've got to remember, in the 1950s and 1960s, Britain was heavily industrialised. It's not like now, where if Ford pulled out, it wouldn't make maybe that much difference. But if major industry pulled out in the 1960s, that was basically where most working class people were working. Most working class people worked in a factory of some sort, whether it was in the textiles, in steel, in car making, whatever you name it, they were basically in factories. So if all of those people pulled out, that means there'll be massive unemployment across Britain. It's not like the service industry we see today. So the economy was different. So politicians felt a bit bounced into it by big business. Nearly everybody made a decision about the Brexit. Everybody mainstream said it's the worst thing that could ever happen. CBI, the Confederation what's CBI? Confederation of business industry, isn't it? It's basically the club of big business. CBI represents the biggest businesses in Britain, the directors, the major business holdings in Britain, the CBI represents. The CBI was totally opposed to Brexit. Why would they totally oppose to Brexit? Because big business likes European integration because it gives the free movement of capital, the free movement of goods, and a tariff-free zone. So they think it's a great idea. And on the back of it, they can also get the cheap labour that was coming from the former Eastern European countries. So today, the British economy is not industrial-based, it's service-based. So if you run a hotel or building construction and hospitality is one of the biggest sectors in Britain. So if you're in hospitality or in construction, low labour is fantastic, cheap labour is fantastic. So on one hand, you go to the government and say, look, we want to be in the European Union, but on the other hand, they say, we don't want too heavy immigration policies, because those Eastern Europeans, very good at construction, very well trained in the former Soviet Union, the former socialist countries, were very well trained and educated. So their standard of construction is very high. So they want them to come over here because they can get cheap labour basically. And if you look at all over the hospitality sector, which is hotels, bars, clubs, and all those industry, all the service industry and shops, it's hard to find somebody who's English born, English speaking. They might be English speaking, but the English is not their mother tongue. And why is that? Because again, it undermines the economy, because they can get them in, or try to get them in on cheaper labour, because we all know if you're an immigrant, you're willing to do anything for your family. So you'll take whatever jobs go in. But if you're born in this country, you're not so keen to work at McDonald's. You don't want a job. You don't think, well, I live in England, I'm going to work at McDonald's. You think McDonald's is just something you do when you're at university or at college. But you don't want a career in McDonald's or working at Sainsbury's. So these are the sort of jobs that the British public, the British working class, don't want to go into. or working in a hotel as a, you know, basically just being a chambermaid, or, you know, changing sheets and just doing that sort of job. People don't want to do those sort of jobs as a career. So those the so-called manual jobs, a lot of the British public don't want to fill. So immigrant labour fills those positions, and that's great for big business because it keeps your labour costs down. And also, they're generally ununionised, which is also great for business because it means you don't challenge them. And typically, those staff don't have mortgages, they're not stakeholders in the society, so they're fairly compliant in terms of certain behaviours because, as I said, they're not unionised. So when we look at the Brexit vote now, why did the white working class predominantly vote Brexit, and the so-called educated elite voted against Brexit? They were the leavers, or the remainers, or the remoaners, as some people call them, moaning and groaning all the time because the vote went against them, right? They call them the remoaners. But a lot of the remoaners were the elite. So all the major institutions in Britain were totally against leaving the European Union, which is interesting. So why were they all against? Because they felt that there is some different nationalist views about it. They feel that European integration is a good thing. You know, it's good to be able to go on holiday. It's good to have European integration. They're your brothers and sisters across Europe. So there's that kind of emotional side of it. But the more hardcore political side of it is the argument that it's good for business. It's the biggest trading bloc. It's 510 million people. It's got 30 trillion pounds, sorry, $30 trillion. It's in dollars because most of these things, when you do the research, is in dollars. $30 trillion economy, the European Union. So it's the biggest economy in the world, the European Union. There's no trading bloc that's bigger. So if you're in big business, you want to get a share of the pie. Now, the problem is the working class don't feel they're getting a share of the pie. So the European Union project hasn't resolved all the problems of the working class. So predominantly the white working class in this country have been the people who have suffered, particularly the white male working class, but the white working class has been disintegrated by a lot of things. Let's go through some of those examples. If you look at industrialization, with the collapse of industrialization in Britain, most of the industrialized workers were white working class, male. That employment has almost been wiped out in this country. So you didn't have to have the highest level of education. You could go in to get an apprenticeship in a construction company, into a factory, into one of the car makers, and you could have a career for life, nice pension, and get a council property, and life was reasonably decent. Yeah, good life. Today, a young white working class boy with not much education is now struggling to get an apprenticeship that will give him a career. So now they go into, work in a car phone shop, go and work in Sainsbury's, go and work in these places where it doesn't look like there's much of a career. And today, access to a council property is far more terrible than it was 50 years ago. So now the confusion is, what is the problem? The problem is the free market system that says that's the way it is. It's just the way it is. What did Thatcher say when she was in power? There's no alternative. That's what she said. There's no alternative. This is the way it is. The free market is the way it is. The reason why highest prices is high is because that's what people are willing to pay for them. That's the way it is. But the white working class say, no, that's not the way it is. This is not fair. Unfortunately, through racist politicians and opportunist politicians, they teach the white working class that the reason why you haven't got a council flat is not because we don't build them and we sold off 2 million of them. It's because those immigrants have got your flats. Those immigrants are getting your properties. It's those immigrants that are taking your jobs. Not that we don't have enough jobs or we don't have enough well-paying jobs. It's those immigrants that are taking your job. Look, if those immigrants weren't here, you'd all be earning 50,000 a year. You'd all have a lovely council property and everything would be lovely. The reason why the NHS hasn't got enough money is because all these immigrants are using it. This is all nonsense. And there's loads of evidence to prove it if you don't believe me. Look at the evidence. How much do people who are not British citizens use the NHS? When you actually look at the figure, it's peanuts. It's a few million. But the NHS costs 30 billion or whatever it costs. The reason why the NHS is in its state is because there's not enough money going in it. Think about it. When Thatcher was in power, income tax was 33%. Today, income tax is 20%. And the allowance is at £10,000 to £12,000. Think about it. Every £1 you take off income tax, every 1% you take off income tax, the government loses between 6 and 7 billion in cash. Think about it. So 13% drop in income tax is worth times 6 to 7 billion. So we're talking 70 to 80 billion pounds a year. If income tax was still at 33%, the government would be getting 80 billion more than it's getting now. That would be enough to build all the houses we need. The NHS would be fully funded with 12 billion a year. Education would be fully funded. The whole country would be fully funded. Public sector would have enough money for jobs. We'd all be comfortable. But we don't. So the government that's in power at the moment, we all know, doesn't care about the average person. The Conservatives, the history of the Conservatives, look up the history of the Conservative Party. The history of the Conservative Party, it was a party of the elite. Always has been, always will be. So it's not interested in working class people, but it pretends it does. So from an African point of view, or people of African origins, or even Asian origins, but I'm here to talk about from an African perspective. So those Africans who are born here, Africans' origins from the Caribbean or Africa, doesn't matter. Now, we can take it from a point of view of us living in this country. Now, when you look at the working class, we make up a very small percentage of the working class, but as a people, we are working class predominantly. Because the majority of us, there's only about 1 million Africans living in this country, just over 1 million. So the majority of our people are working class. They're in working class jobs and they're not high rate taxpayers. High rates taxpayers is 43 upwards thousand. Most people, if you look at the census, most of our people are below that level. So we're basically working class. So that means that if you look at the Brexit vote, again, most of our people, I would presume, I don't know the exact evidence, but I presume a lot of our people would have voted to remain. Why? Because they see the benefit of integration with Europe and they can see, you know, you can go on holiday and all that sort of thing. It's on a basic sort of level because the average African doesn't think, oh, it's all the immigrants that have taken the jobs. They're not looking at the world from that point of view. So they saw the benefit of being part of the European Union. Now, but here's the problem. When people like Jeremy Corbyn come along and says he wants to nationalise parts of the economy, he wants to intervene in jobs, he wants to intervene in the economy, the European Union rules at the moment say, actually, a lot of the things he wants to do, he can't do. Yes, he can nationalise, but he can't pump money, state money into business because the European Union restricts the amount of money you can invest. The state can invest in business and intervene in business because it's called unfair competition. Which means if you get a left of centre government, like a Jeremy Corbyn-led government, he would have problems implementing some of the things he says he wants to do because, pardon me, the European Union rules wouldn't allow him to do it. Which means the left of centre government struggles to function in Europe. If you don't believe me, look at Greece. What happened in Greece when they voted in a left of centre government? They couldn't implement virtually any policy they wanted to implement. Virtually nothing the Greek government wanted to implement, they could implement. So they're a democratically elected government in Greece couldn't implement hardly any of their policies because basically Germany and the European Union were dictating to them what they could and couldn't do because of the European Union rules and because of the bailout. So that meant that even though you voted for a government that you said could do X, Y, Z, they couldn't actually implement it. And in the same way, you could potentially vote for a Jeremy Corbyn government here and find that he can't implement a lot of the things he could do. So Brexit gives an open door because if there was a Labour government after Brexit, they actually could implement some of those interventionist behaviours because the European Union rules wouldn't prevent them from doing it. So they could make any rules they want because they would have control of the economy. So that's why we need to look at it not just simplistically as British citizens of people living in Britain and that, oh, they're all racist, all the people who are Brexit all racist. Well, some of them may well be racist, but that I don't believe was the majority reason why people voted. I think it was predominantly an economic decision with racism in it to emotionally wind people up and get people to vote that way. And I would say it's exactly the same what's happened with Trump in the United States. The reason why the white working class in America voted for Trump is because he wound them up with racism and, you know, hate the Mexicans, hate this and hate that. But if you look at the essence of what he said, he did speak to their issues. He said it's wrong that American governments have allowed factories to be closed down, losing thousands of jobs and moving all the jobs to Malaysia or other parts of the world. And because he spoke to those issues, they felt he was speaking to them. Who's speaking to the white working class in this country? Who's speaking to the working class Africans in this country? Who is protecting those people whose jobs are being wiped out across the country? Who's speaking to that agenda? The European Union wasn't defending our rights, and neither was the British government. So this is part of the problems with it. So When we look at it from the African continent's point of view, we have an interesting situation. Just a couple of examples, both the Caribbean and Africa. My parents, Barbados and Dominica. So I'll give you a simple example in Dominica. Dominica has very little resources other than tourism, and tourism is not that well developed. The banana industry was one of the major industries in Dominica in the Caribbean. Now, because of the historical ties between Dominica and Britain, because of colonialism and the Commonwealth, so-called Commonwealth, there was a very favourable economic deal between Britain and Dominica to sell bananas at certain prices and so on. The European Union for years has been lobbying to say this is wrong, we should look at it from the European Union's point of view, and Dominica should get no special privileges or any special deal. We should buy the bananas from Latin America, which are cheaper. So there's been lots of pressure, and that's hurt the economies in places like in the Caribbean because of that shift. So that's just a simple example of where the European Union has not necessarily worked in the favour of Africans in other parts of the world. Also, in Africa itself, again, if Africa wants to trade with Britain or trade with any part of Europe, at the moment, most of the trade links are the former colonial links. So the French-speaking Africa predominantly trades with France. The English-speaking Africa predominantly trades with England. The Spanish-speaking Africa is very small, predominantly trades with Spain. The Portuguese-speaking Africa predominantly trades with Portugal. So therefore, the trade links go in that way. But because they're in the European Union, the trade links are not that straightforward. They still have the European Union rules. So to import goods from Africa to Britain, you have to go for European Union rules. So that tariffs are on them, and therefore you don't get a tariff-free trade into Europe. Brexit does open the potential to break that, and it will break it, because it means African countries, Caribbean countries, other countries around the world could do a trade negotiation with Britain that lifts these tariffs to allow more African goods, more Caribbean goods to come into Britain without the tariffs. And therefore, that could open up a market space to these goods to be sold at more competitive situation. The reason why African agriculture, because you think about it, how is it that if you grow food in Africa, it's more expensive than somebody growing food in England? How is that possible? It can't be, because a tractor in England costs £50,000 for a tractor in England. A farmer needs to earn £50,000 a year, and everything in England is more expensive than Africa. So how can food in Africa be more expensive than food in Europe? The reason why is because European food is subsidized by the European Union. And therefore, African food trying to import into Britain is more expensive in many areas, or blocked because of tariffs. So making it uneconomic for African farmers to get food into places like Britain and Europe. But after Brexit, there's an opportunity, I'm not saying it will happen, but there is an opportunity for African foods and so on to come into Europe without these barriers. Because Britain, one of the things Britain doesn't like is the protection for farmers in places like France. They hate the agricultural policies that protects these farmers, and Britain would want to dismantle some of that, because there's not such a big dependency on food and agriculture in Britain and fisheries as there is in some other parts of Europe. So there opens a door to trade agreements between Africa and here. The problem we have is we have to hold our hands up and say the governance of African countries is very poor. And we're not united. So the problem we have is the same problem we had in the 1950s that Kwame Nkrumah talked about in Africa Must Unite, when he wrote the book in the 1960s about basically why Africa should come together as a continental unity. And think about all the things that happen in Europe. Is basically, Nkrumah talked about all this in the 1950s and in the 1960s. We need a common currency. We need no borders. We need everybody having the same African passport. He said the military should be integrated to have one African military, because if you had one African military, it'd be very difficult to have a coup. In America, to have a coup is very difficult, because you can't have a coup in California, because the troops in California are not Californian troops, they're American troops. So they're first loyal to America, they're not loyal to California. If you have troops in Ghana, if you bribe the troops in Ghana or infiltrate them, they may topple the government in Ghana. But if the troops in Ghana are African troops, that's a bit more trouble, that's a problem. Because you can't just topple the Ghanaian government, because the troops there are not Ghanaians. So they're not angry necessarily with the government, they're not loyal to they don't have an issue with the Ghanaian government specifically. So these are the reasons about integration. He talked about a common currency where the whole of Africa has the same currency and the same trade. Now, the problem with Africa is, for example, the Ivory Coast has cocoa, Ghana has cocoa. So the European Union goes to the Ivory Coast and plays them off against each other to get the cheapest cocoa price. Now, if Africa was unified, we could say there's only one price. This is the price you buy cocoa for, take it or leave it. We know chocolate markets around the world will collapse without our cocoa. And chocolate is the second product, is the secondary products that make all the profit. We don't make the profit because we're not making enough chocolate. The chocolate is predominantly made in Europe, but it's supplied by us. But if we controlled cocoa prices, so we said, right, no cocoa in Africa can be sold unless it's that price, because you can only buy it from one source, an African source. At the moment, you can undermine, you can go to Ghana and go to Ivory Coast and play them off and say, who wants our business? And you play them off against each other and say, who's going to give us the cheapest price? And you keep playing them off against each other. If they came together and said, no, this is what OPEC did. In 1970s, all the oil producing countries in the world came together and said, no more, and we're going to allow the West to control oil prices. We're going to come together, and they doubled oil prices overnight. In the 1970s, they said, right, we're going to double the price. And since then, they've controlled it, or had semi-control over it. And that's the difference. And in the African Union, that's what we as African people should be thinking about, lobbying and putting pressure on African Union to come together so they have a common economic policy. So when they negotiate with the European Union or negotiate with Britain, they negotiate as a bloc. So they get goods and things supplied as a bloc. So you can't buy diamonds from South Africa and then play them off against diamonds in Botswana, or, as I said, cocoa in Ivory Coast. You can't play us one against the other. If we had the whole of Africa as one economic trading bloc, they would have the same power that the European Union has, which is, if you want to trade with Europe, you have to come through the European Union. If you want to trade with Africa, you have to come through the African Union. And they have the same kind of principles and standards, but the African Union hasn't quite developed to the same way. We can play a role in this because we can lobby the governments that our families come from and put pressure on them and campaign to say, this is what you guys need to do. You need to have more integration. You need to come together in the Caribbean and in Africa, because if you come together, you have more power. We all know that the Caribbean individually are much weaker than if they came together as a bloc. So my parents come from Barbados and Dominica. They haven't got as much economic power on their own as they would if there was a trading bloc of the whole of the Caribbean. So that kind of gives you an idea of the context of Brexit and why we need to look at Brexit from a different point of view. And we as a people shouldn't fear Brexit as saying, oh my God, it's a terrible thing, Brexit, you know, how are we going to travel to Europe and all that. You're still going to be able to travel to Europe. You're still going to be able to go on holiday. There's not going to be a problem. There's no way on earth that the European countries are going to want to make it difficult for the British to travel to Europe, because a lot of their tourism comes from Europe. Spain, for example, they're going to lose absolutely billions of pounds if they make it difficult for people to travel to Spain. So Africans who have these sort of what I call soft concerns is irrelevant. What about Germany? German cars. If the German government agree that they're going to put massive tariffs on cars made in Britain, what happens if Britain put tariffs on German cars and French cars? The French and the Germans are not going to want tariffs on Renaults, BMWs, Audis, Mercedes, because if you put tariffs on them, it's going to be they're going to make those cars even more expensive, and they're not going to be so popular here. So there's a bit of a tit for tat situation here. If you have tariffs on the British goods, they can bang tariffs on your goods. So there's a little bit of the European Union are in a bit of a difficult situation, because anything that hurts Britain, they could hurt Europe. So it goes each way, because they don't want to lose Britain's money. Britain spends a lot of money in Europe. You know, it's the biggest trading bloc, so they don't want to lose that. So we as Africans shouldn't have worries about Brexit. What we need to do is we need to look at what government is best for us. Is it a left of centre government? Is it a right government? What type of government is good for us? And we say, oh, well, they're all racist. Well, that's a bit simplistic to just say they're all racist. They have different interests. It's clear that the current Labour Party has shifted to the left. There's no doubt about it. And that party has shifted more to the working class base. There's no question about it. You know, I don't endorse the Labour Party, but it clearly has shifted as a movement. What we need to decide is whose interest, where would we position ourselves? Yeah, now if you're a well-to-do, middle-class African living in Britain, you might say, well, I'm a Remainer because I want to keep my privileges, I want to keep my way of life, and everything's fine. I go to the Caribbean on holiday, I've got a nice car, I've got a nice house, everything's good. But if you're like the majority of our people, which is more like the white working class, where we've got council properties or we're renting, we're not necessarily doing so well, we've got slightly more insecure employment, we're paid a little bit less, our life is not quite so rosy, Brexit is an opportunity, because there's an opportunity out of Brexit that there could be a better Britain.